Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's learning session on Zero Net Deforestation, organized by World Wildlife Fund's Forest and Climate Program. Thank you for taking the time to join us. My name is Breen Burns, and I'm a manager for communications. Our presenters today are Stephen Cornelius of WWF-UK and Mike Willison of Climate Advisers. And before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and frequently asked questions. For those of you who have participated in these past sessions, this is a familiar spiel, but the answer to our most frequently asked question is yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find a recording within a few hours on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate, or go to youtube.com/WWF Forest Climate. There are two audio options. You can listen via your computer speakers, or you can dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you have audio difficulties while listening via your computer, this is sometimes caused by having too many software applications or internet browser windows open. So feel free to close some of those, and that usually solves the issue, or you can always join us via the phone. And if you're having any technical difficulties, please send Jenny Guzman a message via the chat area if possible, and she will try to help you get everything sorted out. Questions are certainly welcome, and because we have two presenters on this session, if possible, please indicate whether your question is for Stephen or Michael when you submit it. We're all in different offices right now, so this makes it a little bit easier logistically for us to sort out who can best answer your question. And you can send your questions in using the toolbar on your screen, and we will answer as many as possible during our allotted time. And after the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email to our YouTube channel where you can find the recording of the session. So thank you again for joining us, and with that we'll get started, and I will turn it over to Steve. And Steve, if you want to do a brief introduction, and then you can get going here, and I will hand over presenter rights in just a minute. So go ahead, Steve.
Thanks, Breen. Hello everyone, and welcome to the talk today. So as Breen said, my name's Stephen Cornelius. I am the Chief Advisor on Climate Change at WWF UK, so I'm here, not quite in London, but more or less in London. I'm standing in today for Will Ashley Cantello, who is the Chief Advisor on Forests, and he was unable to be present today. So just a little bit of background on this work. This is a collaboration between WWF UK and Climate Advisers, so Will and Mike will be talking later. And I guess as the session today, we've got two main aims. One is to inform you guys who have kindly joined on the main findings of the work. And second, I guess, is to, from that, encourage, we're trying to encourage that forests be well represented in the pledges that countries make when they make their pledges to the UN climate conference later in the year. And just a little bit more background about me. I have recently joined WWF UK from most recently I was the RED and land use change and forestry negotiator for the British government. So I know a little bit about the forest side. Okay, so looking at the slide in front of us, this is talking about the risks and setting the scene a bit. So, I mean, clearly forests are important. So we've got the idea that the second largest cause of greenhouse gas emissions after burning of fossil fuels. So the order of 16 to 19% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So they're an important chunk of what we care about related to climate change. They're disappearing rapidly. So it says 2 football pitches a second. The FAO from 2000 to 2010 suggests order of 15 million hectares a year. If you like your things measured in sizes of Wales, the country, this is 7 times the size of Wales. So it's a large area of land being cleared every year. And if we think about how and why this is happening, you've got direct drivers such as the main one being agriculture. You've got things such as logging, need to build infrastructure, mining, urban expansion. So you've got a lot of reasons why this is happening, and underlying that you've got even more, perhaps more complex interactions of social and economical and political processes. So commodity prices, population growth, policy, governance. There's a lot of reasons why forests are disappearing, but the key message is we know that they're disappearing fast. The third bullet talks about that there's progress being made, and so the often quoted example is in Brazil, where we've seen decoupling of agricultural production from deforestation. So deforestation rate has declined whilst agriculture production has increased. Now, some work that WWF has done recently is around the deforestation fronts. So I'll flip onto the next slide. Yep. So the map that you see shows the 11 deforestation fronts identified in this previous piece of work. 10 of them are in the tropics, and you see the sort of the Amazon, Borneo, Congo basin. So the big areas of forest, and this work showed that 80% of the projected deforestation was likely to occur in these areas. So that's why these areas were the focus. And again, why do we care about this? We care about because these places contain some of the richest wildlife in the world. So there's great amounts of biodiversity there. There's also, these are home to a lot of communities. They provide a lot of ecosystem services. So, it's all an important place. The bullet on the slide suggests 120 to 170 million hectares could be lost in these sort of fronts to 2030. So we need to focus international area effort on these places. Now, if we talk about the risks, I'm going one slide forward to the opportunities. Now, 2015 is an important year. We have a couple of processes going on, twin processes. So the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, where we're looking for a deal in Paris in December, and the post-2015 development process, where again we're looking for some sort of agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals in New York in September. And both of these have, they're interdependent processes, and so without sustainable development, we feel that the threat of climate change can't be averted, and without action on climate change mitigation and adaptation, sustainable development achievements won't be necessarily sustainable. So they're both important and intertwined. And there's an opportunity here for this to sort of help us halt deforestation. So what this work has looked at is we have these targets. We have countries coming forward with some pledges under these conventions, suggesting that they will take on some action in terms of amounts of deforestation that they will reduce. And we're looking at, how far does all this action, when aggregated, how far does it get us? If you look at the box on the right, we're comparing this to a couple of targets. So one is where WWF has said, okay, we want net deforestation and degradation by 2020. So an ambitious target saying, basically in the next 5 years, we would like to see net zero. We're also comparing this to what we've heard stated politically. So in September last year, Ban Ki-moon held a summit in New York where a number of countries, some subnational governments, some civil society organizations, some businesses, so a lot of different actors got together and said, made a declaration on forests which said, okay, we're going to halve, our aim is to halve natural forest loss by 2020 and end it by 2030. And there was also a goal around restoring 350 million hectares. So there's some, I guess, goalposts out there, some ideas out there of what we're trying to assess the pledges so far against. So the big question about this work is how far does what countries have said politically, how far does that get us towards zero net deforestation and the New York Declaration targets? So with that overview, I'd like to hand over to Mike, who, as I said, has been working with my colleague Will Ashley-Cantello on this new piece of work.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And welcome to everybody. Nice to see some familiar names as well as new names on the list of folks joining us, and welcome to those listening to the recording later as well. My name, as mentioned, Michael Wallison. I'm with a small consultancy in Washington, D.C. called Climate Advisers, and we have spent many, many years collectively working to strengthen global climate ambition. In particular, we have a focus on forests and emissions from tropical deforestation. And we work in a number of different contexts to try to slow and reverse global deforestation. The work that we've done with WWF, as mentioned, was a joint project. My work on that was both funded directly by WWF-UK as well as by a grant that I have through the Center for Global Development from NORAD. So thank you to NORAD for their support. And some of this work was also funded by and will inform a report for the New Climate Economy report that will be coming out later this year as well. So thanks to the funders. Now, moving on and talking about the work itself, I'd like to provide a little context. Bree, do I have control of the webinar?
You should.
All right, let me try page down. It's not moving forward.
Okay.
If you could page forward for me.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So the context that I like to place on this as a climate focused forest advocate is really the ambition that we need globally to put the world on a safe path for the climate, or at least a good chance of being on a safe path. So this chart that you see in front of you is a chart of annual global emissions, climate emissions, both historical and what we think may happen into the future through 2030, either as a business as usual up at the top line, a set of Paris pledges that we analyzed that assuming that the US, EU, and China met their pledges and other countries came forward with relatively weak pledges, that would be the light blue line, versus if countries came forward with what we would think would be the strongest set of pledges we could expect. And the thing that jumps out on this chart is that even if countries come forward with what would be relatively strong pledges for their nationally determined contributions in Paris, there's still a significant gap between where we would be and where we need to be. And that gap is about 50%. The key reason in our analysis is that, to a large degree, the structure of the international agreement as it is coming forward is more of a bottom-up world where every country is pledging what it will do at home. And collective action, what we can all do together, has somewhat fallen off of the international radar screen. And the international collaboration is an important piece that can help close that gap. So forests, in particular, are a key area for collective action. And this report and this analysis is intended to ask how much room is there to close the emissions gap through forest action, how much of that has already been pledged or put forward by various countries, and how much further can we go based on the goalposts that Steve mentioned. So moving forward, let's see if I can, still not having control of the keyboard, so if you could page forward for me. This slide is showing some of the data inputs that we have. I'm going to walk through a couple slides of our methodology for the report, so bear with me and we'll get to the results in a minute. And just a few points about methodology that I think are important. First, and I'm showing a chart of all of the various sources we collected that were trying to quantify the emissions from Indonesia's land use, forest and other land use sectors. What you'll notice from this chart is that the lines are all over the map. There's a range of different estimates coming from different sources. And while this is an extreme example with Indonesia, many countries show a wide range of variability in different data sources. So there are some decisions to make as we analyze both area and emissions. The variability in sources is present in area estimates, so deforestation area loss, as well as other things. So those different data sources need to be chosen to actually do an analysis like this. We need to pick which sources to use. So guiding principles for our selection of data, and in particular selection between the two primary sources that are being discussed right now, which is the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, versus a new satellite, global satellite data from Matt Hansen's group at the University of Maryland. We try to choose based on country-driven data. And the reason for this is that our unit of analysis in this report is not just tons, and it's not just hectares. It's also, there's a unit of analysis of government commitments, pledges, and plans, all of which are from the point of view of the forest country governments themselves or subnational governments. And so it's important for us, in order to interpret those pledges and commitments carefully, to actually hew closely to the data that those countries themselves have used to measure and monitor their forest sectors and land use. So generally, as a guiding principle, we choose to go with data from the government itself. And because the framing for this is not just zero net deforestation as a 2020 target, it's also the opportunity in 2015 through the SDGs and the climate commitments. We also give a little bit of priority to reporting that countries have done in the context of the climate agreement. So those are just some brief principles in terms of actually selecting the data. So the next slide, please. Given that there are many dozen forest countries in the world, we also needed to choose to focus down into just a few of the forest countries. It would be prohibitively time-consuming to do an analysis of the commitments from every single country. So we needed to pick some countries, and we did that with a couple criteria. First and foremost, we filtered out to those countries that are represented in the 11 deforestation fronts that Steve presented up front. This is really a criteria about future deforestation. We wanted to focus our analysis in those areas of the world where we expect future deforestation to be high. We also added a few additional criteria, which we ranked countries based on, and then we did an analysis and a ranking using both FAO data and the Hansen satellite data of both forest extent and forest loss, as well as tree cover extent and tree cover loss. And I will try to be careful and talk about forests when I'm talking about the FAO data, and tree cover when I talk about the Hansen data. It's just a detail that they actually are measuring very different things, and we learn slightly different things from different data sources. So I want to recognize that even if we don't get into the details much. Anyway, in selecting the countries, you'll see the list of countries on this slide. We captured somewhere between 51 to 61% of tropical forest area in the world, depending on what data source you use. There are 14 countries in our selection. We focused on tropical forest developing and middle-income countries. We left Australia off of this list for this analysis, and that partly was a question of timing. The Australian 11th front emerged halfway through this research, so no real intent to ignore Australia. Thank you. So the commitments that we put forward. The analysis, as I mentioned, was based on commitments that various countries have advanced in a wide range of contexts. And on the left, you see some bullet points of the types of commitments that we included in the analysis, and on the right is really just a slice of a table that's in the report that shows specifically for different countries how many of these commitments had to be worked through and estimated and compared to each other. So a couple of the types of commitments that were a focus: the Copenhagen commitments that were put forward in 2009, the pledges by countries that signed the New York Declaration on Forests, which included a commitment to halve natural forest loss by 2020 and end it by 2030. Countries' pledges for the Bonn Challenge, which was restoration challenges, and we were careful there to only include the natural forest component of restoration commitments, because what we're really interested in and the criteria for zero net deforestation, as far as WWF's definition is concerned, is focused on natural forest loss. So we included, where possible, a breakdown of restoration and only included natural forest restoration. We also took a look for a couple countries of some subnational pledges. So there are states and provinces that signed on to the Rio Branco Declaration, which pledged those provinces to achieving an 80% cut in deforestation by 2020. And we also, where possible, included domestic law and other forest sector strategies that were in the country's laws themselves. So a pretty wide range of commitments. In terms of the country analyses, for every country, so in trying to work through and weed through both the source data with a wide variety of wide variability across data sources, as well as a range of commitments, what we needed to do was model potential pathways going forward and what the various country commitments would achieve, both in terms of area and in terms of emissions. So the two charts that you see in front of you are an example of the types of analyses we did. This is for Colombia, and we have similar charts like this in the paper for each one of the 14 countries that we analyzed. And what you see on the left here is, for Colombia, the most reliable estimates that the country used for historical deforestation area and emissions really were relatively steady. I think those are the FAO estimates that are averaged there across the 2000 to 2012 period. So those represent the purple lines on the left for the historical emissions. And for every country, we divided both area loss and emissions into gross, so total forest area loss, area gain or forest emission sinks, which are below zero on the line, and then a net, both net area loss and a net emissions. So you'll see for each of these a solid line representing net, a dashed line representing gross, and a dotted line representing sinks or forest recovery. So this example for Colombia is interesting. It points out a few different points here. And we can talk about different countries specifically, but Colombia's targets that they've put forward are interesting in the fact that they are specific to the Amazon biome. And so they don't cover forests in other sections of the country. So really we had to do a range of different scenarios for the target for Colombia, because whether it's total national net deforestation would go up or down and by how much really depends not just on what happens in its pledges in the Amazon region, but also what happens in other biomes. And this was a theme that emerged across many of the countries. And for at least 8 of the countries, 8 of the 14 countries, we did some type of subnational analysis by biome, because the pledges that those countries have put forward were either specific to a region or specific to a process or specific to a legal category of forests. So a couple countries have these types of ranges. The other interesting thing that emerges from this set of charts is that on the left for forest area, Colombia has put forward quite an aggressive restoration target as part of the bond challenge. And that restoration target, the reforestation or afforestation that would happen before and through 2020, significantly bumps down the net deforestation or forest loss in Colombia. But there has been no pledge of restoration past 2020. So that bumps back up starting in 2021, because we don't have any notion of how much forest area Colombia would intend to restore after that period. So this disjunction at 2020 is another common feature, and we tried to be careful not to assume that commitments that have been put forward would continue into the future indefinitely. We only interpreted the commitments as they were stated for the periods that they were stated. So what we see for Colombia, just to finish this thought off, is that by one scenario, Colombia, if its deforestation in the non-Amazon region is either stable or declining, they could reach zero net deforestation very quickly if they meet their restoration target. And the green line crosses zero in about 2018 or 2017. So if they restore an area that they have pledged to restore, and if they maintain forest cover or reduce forest cover loss in the non-Amazon region, as well as meeting the Amazon pledge that they've put forward, their net forest loss could drop below zero quite quickly. If non-Amazon deforestation in fact goes up and follows the trend or remains stable, the pattern's a little different, and that's the blue line. So in that case, these forecasts are not bound and do not reach zero net until 2030, based on Colombia's signing of the New York Declaration and a goal of zero natural forest loss by 2030. So that's an example for Colombia. I'm not going to walk through all of these, but I wanted to talk a little bit about one of those charts. So when we go through the exercise of doing this analysis for every one of these 14 countries, and then we roll up to the global scale, we see some interesting results. And this chart is starting to talk a little bit about those global results. A couple things to point out. The left is 2020, and on the right is 2030. And the different blocks here are dark green are the pledges, the area of deforestation that we would expect, net deforestation, and how much of that is based on pledges of reduced deforestation, that's the dark green wedge. How much of that is based on pledges of increased restoration, forest restoration, that's the green lines. And then how much of that is remaining deforestation. So how much of the global deforestation in 2020 would still remain in the countries that we analyzed. And the green wedges together make up all of the countries that we analyzed in our sample, And then the stippled wedge on the left are countries and deforestation that was outside the sample and not analyzed. So we present those, that slice of emissions and that slice of deforestation as if it were to remain stable through 2020 and 2030. And in fact, that's quite conservative because there are countries that are not in our sample that have also put forward pledges. So for example, Mexico put forward, was one of the first countries to put forward an INDC to the UNFCCC, and that Mexico pledge is not reflected in our analysis because Mexico was not in our sample. So in fact, we could be closer than these charts show. But in brief, what we found is in 2020, we estimate that the existing targets in these 14 forest countries, which together represent 51 to 61% of tropical forest area, would, if those targets are met, reduce annual net forest area loss by 3.9 million hectares, or 40%, by 2020. And that 3.9 is just the 2.3 plus 1.6. So on an emissions basis, I'm showing you the area charts, but on an emissions basis, by 2020, this would amount to a reduction in net forest-related emissions globally of 45% in 2020. So we're cutting global forest emissions almost in half just from targets that 14 countries have put on the table in various contexts. So that's pretty good. In 2030, what we see, hold on one sec, thanks. So in 2030, the numbers are a little different. 2.8 million hectares down for net forest area loss in 2030, and a 52% cut in emissions. And the next slide, if you could forward on, thank you, Reed, shows some of the differences here and what countries are driving this change. So in 2020, what we see is the drivers of the forest area change that we forecast through 2020 are split between restoration action and reduced deforestation action. And the charts below, the bar charts that divide up these pies, show which countries are driving this change in forest area loss or forest area restoration. So the things that jump out on the left for 2020, we notice that restoration area is really being driven by the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, which has put forward a very aggressive restoration pledge as part of the bond challenge to achieve 8 million hectares of restoration by 2020. It is a very significant forest area. It's certainly within the realm of possible. Analyses of DRC's potential restoration area certainly warrant that scale of a pledge. But I think it's a cautionary note to realize that 8 million hectares in just the next 5 years would be a restoration rate on par almost with what China has achieved with CDM assistance, and it would be quite an aggressive rate of restoration. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. We did not analyze whether different countries would be able to meet targets they've put forward. We made no judgment about seriousness or likelihood of pledges. That was not our role in this analysis. But I do want to point that out. On the right, in terms of the 2.3 million hectares of reduced deforestation that's been pledged by 2020, a large amount of that is driven by Brazil. And this is a difference between the historical rate from 2000 to 2012 and the expected 2020 rate. Much of that drop is Brazil, but some of it is Indonesia and DRC as well, and other countries. By 2030, the picture shifts. There have been very few restoration pledges that go out to 2030 because the bond challenge really targeted 2020. Brazil has some national targets in national law for restoration area that are reflected here, but most of the 2030 action that we see, the 2.8 million hectares in 2030, is coming from reduced deforestation pledges. I'm going to move ahead. So what remains to be done? This chart is focusing in on 2020 and is taking a look at where remaining action may be needed to be focused, and I shouldn't say action, in fact, this should say remaining pledges. So all of the action still needs to be taken. There's a lot of work to be done to meet the pledges in the countries. But if we take those pledges as given and the world provides the assistance, the developed countries and advanced economies provide the assistance that developing countries have said they need to meet their conditional targets, if all that happens, where else does additional ambition need to come from? So this chart shows that a couple things. The Americas are green, mostly South America, tropical Americas. Gray is representing Asia, and then Africa is the oranges on the left. So if we look first at South and Central America, tropical Americas, what we see is there's still a fair bit of work to do in Brazil. So even with the successes that they've had, the Amazon, Brazilian Amazon is so large, so dominant in terms of the patterns of tropical deforestation globally, that there's still going to be, with their existing pledge, a fair amount of room for Brazil to go further. We also see Paraguay, Bolivia, and to a lesser degree, Argentina, Colombia, and Ecuador emerging, and then a group of other tropical Americas as well. It's important to note here that Peru has dropped off this chart because, in fact, their existing pledges would drop them below zero net deforestation by 2020. The same is true on the left for Africa with the Democratic Republic of Congo. So if DRC meets its restoration pledge, it would also drop below zero net deforestation. So they have dropped off of this chart as well. However, in Africa, the pattern is much different, that most of the remaining forest area loss that has not been addressed by the pledges in this analysis are coming from countries that actually are not in this analysis. So this is deforestation in Nigeria and Zimbabwe and Cameroon and in other areas of Africa where we didn't look closely at individual nations. And that would be that 1.8 million hectares. So the lesson from that to me is that we can't just look at the Brazils and Indonesias of the world if we want to be successful in reaching global ZND. We in fact need to be working everywhere. And we need to be working at countries that have, 1/10, 1/20th, 1/30th of global forests in order to be successful in our global goals. We need to be focused there as well. Then if you look on the bottom, I was just going to mention Asia down on the bottom. The Indonesia wedge is actually quite small here in terms of ZND, and that warrants some explanation because I think Indonesia was a special case in many ways. The Indonesian pledges have been in terms primarily by 2020 of emissions reductions. And because Indonesia's emissions are so heavily dominated by peatlands, we were a little concerned. There's a decoupling for Indonesia between area loss and emissions. So we had to make a number of assumptions about what would happen for Indonesia forest area based on their emissions pledges. So I just want to point that out. Okay, let's go on to 2030. Things shift here, and we see, in fact, that Africa is even more dominant. The other countries in Africa in 2030 are even more dominant in potential for additional action out through that period. And this is starting to speak to me in terms of what is needed through international partnerships between the advanced economies and the forest nations, and the opportunity, in fact, that Paris provides for us to identify partnerships between some of these developing African nations and some of the advanced economies to really pledge to work together to keep this 2.73 million hectares of potential or likely deforestation in 2030 down to a minimum and really reap the benefits both in terms of biodiversity, communities, incomes, but also emissions. So that would be my takeaway from this slide. We move on. So recommendations. I think the analysis at the top level and the global level really draws a couple things to the forefront for us, and they're here. We can read them, but I think the the top line points are really that we have an opportunity in 2015, and in our opinion, both in terms of climate advisors and WWF, the conclusion of this report is that we have the opportunity to structure our pledges as we move into Paris in a way that will create a race to the top and will match ambition or potential ambition from both developing and advanced economies in a way that really could help us reach zero net deforestation quite quickly if we act. And the way to structure these INDCs is we would love to see all relevant forest countries including a time-bound commitment to both zero net deforestation, so on an area basis, as well as zero net emissions on an emissions basis. Different countries will have different timelines. Different countries have already pledged that, but we'd like to see that spread through the world for all of the relevant forest countries. Developing countries, for their part, should clearly quantify in their INDCs the portion of their target that is own action. So if they put forward a forest or land use emissions target, how much of that is self-financed and how much of that is additional mitigation that they would achieve conditional on finance from the developing or from the developed and advanced economies. So this is the style of pledge that Indonesia put on the table. Mexico did for its INDC as well. And we think that that type of dual pledge, that commitment that has both an own action, an aggressive and ambitious own action pledge, but also a very clear signal about how much more these countries would be able to do if they had support, is one way to advance global ambition. For their part, the advanced economies should also take ambitious action at home. And in fact, they need to include forests as well. While our sample focused on the tropical forest countries, recent data is showing that there's massive opportunity to reduce forest loss in northern climates, in boreal zones, as well as in temperate zones. So some of the largest areas of forest loss in 2013 from the satellite data are coming from Russia and Canada. So advanced economies need to have domestic mitigation targets that include their forest sectors. They also need to put forward mitigation targets that they would achieve through international partnerships with developing countries, including forest countries, through mechanisms such as REDD. And finally, we'd love to see accelerated financing for forest protection pre-2020. So we've got 5 years even before the climate agreement's gonna take effect, and we can't wait for this action. So financing for forest restoration and protection need to match the scale of the ambitious commitments that the forest countries have already put forward and tabled, and that needs to happen sooner rather than later. Moving ahead. Finally, as we move forward into the SDG process, we'd also like to see a set of goals in the Sustainable Development Goals that are directly targeted to deforestation and forest emissions, that are in line with the Aichi biodiversity targets, and that those global goals through the SDG process trigger or encourage further work on existing national level action plans. The SDGs are discussing a forest level target, and I think there's an opportunity there for all of us to work with our countries, not just on their climate pledges, but in reinforcing the need for a global development goal to include forests. So finally, just one final chart. I think the coming back to the INDCs, the climate pledges, we really think it's important to match the opportunity that countries who can do more at home, potentially forest countries, should be able to pledge to do so, and countries that can do more abroad, the developed advanced economies who have caused much of the climate problem in their historical emissions, they need to be doing more abroad and not just acting at home. If we match those two things up, the world really can help close that gap through additional global climate mitigation, including through forests. So that's all I have. I'm happy to pass it back over to Steve, and then we'll take questions.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, just one quick slide from me on the next steps. Actually, this is a bit of a mixture of next steps and some of the recommendations reiterated. So the work that Mike and Will have been doing will be published on the 1st of June, ready for the next UNFCCC session in Bonn. So hopefully there can be some useful discussions about it there. As I said at the beginning, one of the things that we're trying to do with this piece of work is to help inform the settings of the targets and the scrutiny and checking of those targets. So, do they do enough when aggregated, as Mike has just been showing with his charts. The third bullet on this slide is essentially the first recommendation that Mike mentioned a couple of slides ago. So it's the idea that this is an important sector, and we do think it should be included in the pledges that countries come forward with, and especially those where emissions from deforestation is an important part of their emissions makeup. And the fourth bullet is around closing the gap, so using forest conservation as a way of closing the gap. So this work, as I said, will be out on the 1st of June. It will be tweeted. You'll probably get it sent to your inbox several times. It will appear on both WWF and Climate Advisers websites, so I'm sure you won't miss it. So thanks for joining this bit, and I think the next step is that we'll have some questions that Mike and I will attempt to address for you.
Indeed, thank you. So we are now at the question and answer portion of the presentation, and thanks to those who've already started sending in questions. And again, just a reminder, you can use the question tab or tool on your GoToWebinar toolbar and type those in, and we will answer as many as we have time to cover here. So to kick us off, we have a question for Mike from PIPA. And Mike, PIPA asks, what data source did you use for the forest/emission gain? Generally, those data tend to be more uncertain and less often measured than deforestation, but they're very important. Any insights on the implication on this data gap, if you found one, based on this research?
Yes, thank you, Pipa. You're absolutely right to call out the gap. If I'm understanding the question correctly, what you're looking at is the uncertainty and unreliability of reporting of the carbon uptake of forests in various countries. So it was a challenge. The data source that I used was either country reporting to the UNFCCC when it was available, so the difference between gross forest emissions and net forest emissions, which were both reported frequently. I calculated the gross emissions sink from those variables when available. If that wasn't available from country reporting in climate contexts, the FAO calculates both a net and a gross forest emissions in its data sets, and the difference between those, that gross and that net, was used as an estimate for the forest sink in that country. And if neither of those were available, what did I do? I think I used a calculation based on the Hansen average area gain multiplied by some global and regional averages of restoration sinks. So the area gain times the sink, which is a very rough estimate, but it just was what I could do.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And the next question, I'm guessing, I will make a professional estimation that most of these questions will be from Mike. So Mike, the next question is from Bill, and Bill asks, were peat emissions included in the study? And as you are answering that, I'm just going to advance to this next slide so that people can see a few plugs for additional resources from the Forest and Climate Program. But without further ado, please please go ahead there.
Wonderful. And in fact, I actually see Bill asked a few questions, and
Yes.
I might address them. I'm going to address all three of them right now, and I will repeat them so that everyone can hear them as well.
Perfect.
So Bill, thank you for the questions and for joining. So peat emissions were included in the Indonesia analysis specifically. They were not included for any other country. And I know that that is in particular an oversight, or at least a data source challenge, but the data sources that are available for peat emissions were relatively inconsistent in quality, and given the role of peat in Indonesia, it was the one country where I felt like I absolutely had enough data and also enough confidence in the data to include it. So peat's included in Indonesia, but not other countries. Your second question was asking about forest losses in boreal regions and whether those recent forest losses that we've observed in boreal regions are driven by logging or by forest dieback and fires. That's a great question. I haven't focused my own research there, so I will answer with a caveat. My sense is that there are a number of drivers for those boreal forest losses, including fires and dieback. But some of the most concentrated areas of forest loss that we observe are in areas of Russia that are subject to logging and areas of Canada that are subject to tar sands development. So it's a mix of drivers in the boreal regions, and I think there's a lot of research both being done and that needs to be done to tease that apart. And then your last question, I think, is actually a really, really important one, and one that I should have mentioned earlier. Are forest degradation emissions considered in this analysis? And regrettably, no. Degradation was excluded from the analysis for the most part, depending on how different countries treated their forest sector emissions. So if countries are estimating their degradation emissions carefully and in their reporting, then I treated degradation emissions along with deforestation emissions. Not every country is doing that carefully or reliably, and we didn't have enough data on either degradation emissions nor on pledges for degradation in most places to do an analysis of degradation. And I'm really glad you asked that, because it's actually a really important caveat for this research. There are different estimates of the extent and scale of degradation losses globally. So forest degradation, both in terms of logging, active human-driven degradation, where forests are losing cover and losing biomass and losing their health more rapidly than they are recovering, as well as degradation from natural causes, either from changing climate, drying out, and fires, increased pests, and other processes. Those data, the estimates of whether degradation emissions impacts are on the scale of deforestation emissions impacts really range across a wide range. So some estimates place it as high as 50, 60, even 70% as big as actual deforestation area losses. Other estimates have it much lower, more like a quarter. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the world right now of forest degradation, and I look forward to being able to analyze that when we have more data.
Thank you. So jumping right into our next question from Hannah, and Hannah asks, does this research make any recommendations about how to deal with any double counting?
Yeah, that's a great question, Hannah. I think I don't have specific recommendations about double counting, and just to back up a step so that everyone's make sure that we mean the same thing. There's a lot of different things that people mean by double counting, and I'm not exactly sure which color of the double counting issue you're referencing here, but there are a number of different ways that the pledges overlap with each other and possibly repeat each other. So a couple different types of that overlap. would be between corporate commitments and national commitments. So deforestation-free commitments by various corporate supply chains, soybeans, beef, palm oil commitments are all incredibly important, and I did not analyze those as additional to the national commitments. We did get into some analysis of those for a couple countries, and you can see those in the report. I think the other types of double counting that I'm most worried about would be countries that have put forward restoration pledges as well as deforestation pledges. And I think the pledging needs to be very clear by forest countries whether their deforestation targets are net deforestation targets or gross deforestation targets, especially when there are significant amounts of restoration intended. So some countries have put forward very large restoration targets as well as zero deforestation targets that were not specific. And they could reach zero net deforestation either entirely or largely through the restoration, while continuing to lose significant amounts of natural forest. Were there to be clarity on those targets, whether the zero deforestation targets were gross or net, that overlap or potential overlap would at least be clear. And I think that's the type of double counting that I'm most worried about in the near term.
Thank you. And before we jump into the next question, I will just quickly run through briefly these resources that are listed here. I just want to clarify that that top bullet, the deforestation fronts, that links you back to the deforestation fronts report that that Steve mentioned earlier in the presentation about the 11 deforestation fronts around the world. And then the rest of these, again, are just plugs for some of the RED and forest and climate resources that our team does. So please feel free to check those out. And our next question, and we'll probably do this one and then perhaps one more because we are reaching the end of our time, but the next question is from Etienne, and the question is, does the report consider forest management as a mitigation strategy under the heading of forest conservation, or is it rather focused on strict protection?
Great question, Etienne. Thank you. The report was not generally focused at the level of particular mitigation strategies, but rather on forest area and emissions targets that countries and subnational regions have put forward. So the lines that we drew in terms of actions that were included or excluded were more about whether the strategy, the mitigation strategy, was directed at natural forests or at plantation forests. So we did draw a line in terms of restoration, and we did not include commitments to restore forests that were intended to be plantation forests. We also did not include, we didn't analyze the emissions targets that countries had put forward by assessing where those emissions mitigation sources would come from, whether they would be coming from a forest conservation strategy or a forest management strategy. We took the pledges at the countries, at face value, and assumed that the country would have an underlying plan for meeting those pledges.
Thank you. And so the next one, I will read these comments from Mariana, and so they're not questions but comments, and perhaps Mike, you can react to them if you would like to. So Mariana notes, given that the analysis shows the opportunities by 2020 as well as by 2030, it would be great to include in the report a strong recommendation for action pre-2020 to reduce the gap, rather than focusing solely on INDCs. So that's one comment. And should I read the second one, or do you want to react to that one first?
Sure. We did include a recommendation that was not focused on the INDCs, and in fact, that was our recommendation to finance pre-2020 mitigation, both through advanced economies, international financial institutions, and the Green Climate Fund. So I think we did acknowledge that, but given the opportunities that we see as the likely areas for action and attention in Paris, the biggest opportunity is to increase the ambition in the core set of targets that countries are drawing up, which is post-2020.
Thank you. And then the second part of that is the other element that would be helpful is to identify opportunities for each of the countries analyzed, rather than just an analysis of the pledges and gaps. This would help us and other readers hone in on opportunities at the national level.
Great, it's a good comment.
Thanks. And then the final question is from David, and then after this we'll wrap it up because we are 2 minutes over our time here. But David asks, there's an emphasis on collaborative efforts in addition to country actions, but the analysis seems to consider net deforestation only on a national level. Is there consideration of net deforestation at the global level, or is this only based on the assumption that each individual country achieves zero net deforestation? And as you're answering that, I'm just going to advance to the next slide so people can see where to follow you and Steve. So please go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks, David, for a deep and important question. I think we hesitated to focus too much on the extent to which the globe was reaching zero net deforestation as a whole, or particular regions reaching zero net deforestation in and of themselves. And the choice to do that was not one of ignoring or recognizing the need or lack of need for collaborative action, but rather trying to recognize that a goal of global zero net deforestation would actually allow for a level of forest loss in most of the deforestation fronts and in many of the tropical forest countries that far exceeds WWF's standard for what zero net deforestation means. So from WWF's perspective, the definition of zero net deforestation includes a target of having natural forest loss near zero, and that near zero component is really quite critical. And had we focused the analysis at the global level, it's entirely possible that we would be reaching zero net global deforestation quite soon, or in ways that allowed substitution between temperate reforestation in China versus Indonesian highly diverse tropical forest loss in Borneo. And to call that success doesn't match, I think, any of our goals. So we chose to focus down a level in order to recognize the importance of regional forests, the differences of different types of forests, and also the explicit definition of zero net deforestation by WWF.
Thank you. So thank you again to everyone who posted questions and who joined us today. And as I mentioned, you can follow all three of us on Twitter, and Steve and Mike's handles are there. I'm sure they'll be posting the paper there on June 1st when it's published. And you can always send us emails for recommendations on future topics. And with that, I will bring us to a close. So thank you again so much for joining us, and we will see you at the next session, which will be next month, and keep an eye out for announcements on the topic. Thank you again. Bye.